Good afternoon and welcome to the 192nd of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today we have a discussion of food, cooking, and restaurants in the midst of the pandemic with Washington Post food writer Tim Carman. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday, 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. Please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, December 21st, 2020, there are 1,699,085 deaths globally from the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. There are 17,947,644 cases in the United States. And there are now a total of 318,602 deaths reported in the U.S. That's up from 311,529 deaths reported on Friday. I'm really pleased to introduce my guest today, Tim Carman. Let me just tell you a little bit about him. Tim is a James Beard award-winning food writer and columnist for the Washington Post. His work has appeared in numerous editions of the best food writing collections. He's also written for Imbibe Magazine, American Scholar, Food Network Magazine, and other publications. Before joining the Post in 2010, he served as food editor and columnist for Washington City Paper. He lives in Hyattsville, Maryland, with his wife, the writer M. Carrie Allen, and their two dogs, Lucinda and Hans Fluffer. Tim Carman, thanks so much for joining us on COVID Calls today.
Of course. Thanks for asking me to be on.
So I'd like to start the way I usually do, just to find out where you're calling in from and how the pandemic is looking there today.
I am calling from our home in Hyattsville. And, I have been working on this, I think, as you fully well know, since we've had to delay this, I've been working on a story all day. So I have not stepped outside of this house for 1 second. So I have no idea what's going on outside, which I guess is just what we do during a pandemic.
How are things being managed there right now? I mean, you're in the greater DC area, so I know they've been trying to have a kind of integrated approach to lockdown and restrictions, but are you seeing some differences in the district compared to where you are there in Maryland?
So, we're kind of a 3-jurisdiction area. We've got Washington, D.C., suburban Maryland, and suburban Virginia. And all of them have taken, I would say, generally the same approach. I mean, like, from my perspective, they've shut down indoor dining. And D.C. is going to be doing that this week, but they announced it on Friday that they would shut down indoor dining because the numbers, as they are in just about every part of the country, are spiking. The 7-day rolling average is up over the limit that they want for people to be out and about and doing sort of gatherings of 10 or more people. So, they've shut down indoor dining. They shut down museums in the district. They're taking a very cautious approach as the numbers are spiking.
I want to. There's a lot to talk about, with particularly, the difficulty of doing the work that you do over this really crazy year locked in. But I wanted to first just bring some light to an article you published on November 29th. And the headline of the article was, "As a food writer with COVID, I worried I'd lose my sense of taste. It turned out to be much worse." And let me just read a line from this. "My most immediate worry was whether I'd lose my senses of taste and smell." So this is you talking about having COVID-19. Common symptoms for those affected with COVID. Some patients have waited months for their olfactory senses and taste buds to return. I had no idea how I'd do my job if I suffered a similar fate. This is, I mean, I've read just about everything I can get my hands on about COVID-19. This is not a perspective that I had saw coming, and of course, it's beautifully written because you're a great writer.
Thank
Could you
you.
tell us a little bit about um, your experience with the virus and also how you thought about this story?
Of course. So, when I first thought I had it, um, I think that was the first real struggle that I had with just trying to get access to information. And this was really telling because I think it's different in other countries. It's like I had to call my doctor because I was coughing and having a real struggle with energy and breath. And she was like, "Okay, I want you to go to this little clinic. They will give you a quick turnaround test. They can do some other tests, some flu tests, and give me some data that I can help you with and determine how to move forward." So, and I'm already tired. Like I'm exhausted. I don't really want to go anywhere. I just want to like crawl into bed and suffer through it as best I can. But I dutifully follow my doctor's orders and I go to this clinic. And the first person I talked to is like, "No, we can't help you." And there were like reasons why they couldn't, but they said you need to go to an emergency room. And I'm like, "Okay, where? What's the next emergency room?" So my wife takes me to this emergency room that's a couple miles away, and they're so small staff that we just have to wait and wait and wait to get this test. And of course, it's not the quick turnaround test that gives you results in a couple of hours. It's the 2-day response.
Mm.
And I'm so tired and so wanting to be outside of this hospital, which feels like I'm contributing possibly to spreading it in the hospital. And I'm also just in this fluorescent lit uh, room around people wearing PPE, and it's just not a very comfortable environment. And all I want to do is get out. And I got no sort of information that day, positive or negative. I just had to go back home and take a bunch of Tylenol, drink a bunch of water, and wait 2 days to know what was going on with me.
The fear that you had that, well, I should say, I'm glad you're okay. And
Thank you.
and of course, sorry you had that experience, and that uncertainty is one that really resonates, I think, with a lot of people who many just decided not even to get tested. In the early days of the pandemic, were told, don't bother getting a test, and they just treat it as if they had it. This uncertainty has been a real feature. But this particular problem of yours, at least early on, when you were worried about the olfactory aspects of it, I mean, that's really jarring. Now, as you describe in the piece, that ended up not being your symptomology, but that's an
Right.
added layer of stress, and it's such a unique insight. I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that was my major fear as I wrote about it, as you just explained. Like if I had lost my sense of taste and smell, I mean, from all the cases that I've read about and from friends who have got COVID, I mean, at this point I know a number of people that have got the disease, and they all say it lingers. Like, unlike the quick symptoms that happen, the fatigue, the fever, um, the the sense of smell and taste can linger for months.
Mhm.
And when it comes back, it doesn't come back like your palate was pre-COVID. Things may taste off. You may taste more bitterness. And for any person, this is terrible, right? You want to be able to enjoy your food. That's one of the great pleasures of eating, is the
Sure.
sensations, the smells, the flavors. I mean, it's bad for anyone, but for my job, I was like, there is no way I could do this job uh, and have this happen to me. Like I'm sure the Post and my editors would have figured out a way around it.
Mhm.
I would have just become a reporter for a few months until I felt like my palate was back to normal. But it was a real question mark, and it caused a lot of angst for me. And I think every day I would wake up like, is today the day that I can't taste anything?
Yeah. I wonder, could you tell us, maybe this is a trade secret and you can't tell us, but is there something you eat or drink that tells you I have my full talents?
Well, I think everything. I mean, there's not
Yeah. Okay.
one. Yeah, I mean, like if you can't smell the coffee, like I'm a
Okay.
big coffee buff, and I have all these tools in the kitchen for making good coffee, and I can tell the difference between an East African coffee and a Central American coffee. Both, well, mostly just by taste, not necessarily by smell. But if I couldn't tell that, I would know immediately that things are wrong.
You said in the piece at the end, after you described this experience, horrible experience, this life and the people with whom we choose to share it are all that we have, and I feel like I have my life back. I can breathe again. And once we're on the other side of the pandemic, I plan to spend as much time as possible occupying the same airspace as the people who helped us through this ordeal. We'll laugh together, eat together, and breathe freely together. I feel like that must be, first of all, an experience that everybody can connect with. But I think particularly, I'm sort of curious on your take on this as a food writer. Part of your job is really to convey that experience. I mean, a lot of us we all go to restaurants all the time. Of course, one of the normal things that most of us have had to give up. But most of us don't pay as much attention as you do to that part of life. So when I read that article and I read that last part, you said that really hit me hard, because I thought, wow, he's a person who's really attuned to what we're missing in that regard.
And this is probably why it's not fun to eat out with food writers sometimes.
You're paying too much attention to everything that's going on.
I've had my wife poke me a few times, say, "Hey, I'm over here." I think the point that I was really getting at that last paragraph was, part of the enjoyment of eating out is to be with friends. It really is not just about the food on the plate. It is, and I'm sure we've all experienced this. It's sitting around a table with really maybe your best friends in the world, maybe drinking a little too much, maybe throwing a little caution to the wind, telling a joke. All of this that occurs around a table that really doesn't often happen anywhere else. And this is what I love about eating out with friends. It's like we get together, we go to this one place, we eat well, we drink well, we laugh, we catch up, we tell the stories. And after all this was, after I started to feel better, I thought about my friends and my loved ones, and because they really helped us through this. My wife got COVID too, as I explained in the essay. So we were both sick together, and we got texts, we got phone calls, we got emails, we got everything. People were dropping food off on our front porch, day after day, multiple deliveries a day, more food than two people could ever eat. And afterwards, I was just like, these are the people that I love and I want to spend time with. And I would like to do it around a dinner table. Maybe other people have different ways of appreciating their friends, but that's really where I love being around my friends.
Just a reminder that you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Washington Post food writer Tim Carman today. Tim, you wrote an obituary of the chef Floyd Cardos early on, back in March, and I'll post that obituary up on Twitter. Can you say a little bit about Floyd Cardos for people who may not be familiar with him?
I think Floyd, that was a real shock, because Floyd was a chef that I think maybe a lot of people didn't know about. He was born in India, but was considered like one of the first chefs to bring Indian flavors into a sort of American fine dining atmosphere. And, he did that with Tabla, this restaurant that's run by Danny Meyer, who's probably arguably the most famous restaurateur in America. And I think his passing really hit people hard. I mean, especially people in my business, because he was such a pioneer and he was still relatively young. Um, and I think it was maybe the first time we realized that this was a disease that doesn't just affect the old, the infirm, but it affects people in their prime, who or should be in the prime of their lives.
When the pandemic broke out, and as we moved into March and into April with lockdowns in big cities across America, what were you thinking then about how that impact would look on the restaurant industry? And maybe just tell us a little bit about, now you have 9 months going along. What has surprised you about that? What have been the points of resilience, and what are the points of just real despair in that industry?
Well, I think there was a lot of naivete at the beginning, uh, including myself. I mean, the early lockdown, um, people thought maybe a few weeks and we'd get through this. Like, I remember when the Post decided to close down, they said, you'll be back we'll come back at the end of March. And, I think all of us even then realized that was probably too early. Like, why would the pandemic or why would the virus disappear in 2 weeks? Um, I think there was probably some guidance at the time, thinking if we all went into lockdown and it was, fully enforced, that we would really decrease the the amount of virus around us, and as other countries did that went into like serious lockdowns. And but we didn't as a country, and so this lingered, and it lingered a long time. And when restaurants first went into lockdown, um, I think they had a similar thought. We don't know how long this is going to last, uh, but we're going to make the best of it. We're going to, you know, we'll provide for our own. A lot of them immediately went into sort of a pop-up mode where they were giving out free food to folks in the industry that didn't have a safety net, that didn't have access to um, any sort of like unemployment insurance. I'm sure as the restaurant industry employs a number of people who are undocumented, so they don't have access to the kind of money that would support people during this time. So they were immediately pivoting to ways to help these people that had been propping up the restaurant industry for months. um, and I think that went on for weeks and weeks. And as restaurants realized that this was not going to end soon, I think the panic set in. I mean, panic from how do we get through this? What's going to be our way to get through it? But I think the thing that it's maybe not easy to recognize if you're not in the restaurant industry or write about it or talk to the people in it, is that these are incredibly creative folks.
Mm.
Like, they pivot. It's like, you think about what it takes when something goes wrong in a kitchen and how quickly they have to respond to it.
Sure.
They did basically the same thing with the pandemic. It's like they found very fast ways to deal with this. They pivoted into creating little shops, little markets where they would sell goods and goods. It could be pantry items, it could be toiletries, it could be things that people really needed. They would do, as it went along, they created pop-ups, they created ghost kitchens, which are these sort of carve outs in the back of the house of the restaurant that would sell, comfort foods like maybe hamburgers or cheesesteaks or tacos, and they would just sell it for takeaway. And they were doing it as a complete 180 from their normal restaurant concept. And they were finding they could make money from this. They were pivoting into takeout, which for some restaurants was not easy. If you're like a fine dining restaurant that is used to doing multi-course menus or tasting menus, suddenly to devise menus that people could take away, that's not an easy thing to do, nor is it easy to convert your entire operation which has been devoted to full service restaurants, into something that is basically like a fine dining version of Domino's, And so they've done all of these things, and they still suffer. I think there are some restaurants that have done decent, and by decent, they're maybe down only 20-30% from year over, which is still decimating, given that the profit margin of your average restaurant, good profit margin would be 10%. So to be down 20-30%, you are barely hanging on. You are finding creative ways to hang on. You're limiting the employees that you hire. You're operating fewer hours. You're limiting the menu. You're looking for all sorts of creative ways to lower your overhead costs. But 8 months, 7, 8 months, 9 months into the pandemic, I think the restaurant industry really, and even earlier on, I think they realized they needed economic help, and that's where they've been putting a lot of their eggs in that basket. The independent restaurant community created a lobbying group because they didn't have one. There was a big national restaurant association, but the small independents felt like they needed to have their own voice in Congress. So they, pooled their resources and went full force to lobby Congress for like direct benefits, direct relief to restaurants. And it failed. I mean, that was what I was writing about today. They didn't get it. And I think they're sort of devastated by that, but they did get some things. But, I think it just indicates that they're an industry that's a large industry, employs 11 million people, creates nearly $1 trillion in revenues in the country. And they felt like they didn't have a place at the table. And without a place at the table, they never were going to get the money that they felt they deserved. And without that money, I think many of them feel like they're going to die, like they just won't make it. And the death rate is all over the map. You've got people predicting 30%. You've got people predicting 85% of restaurants won't make it through the pandemic. I mean, who knows what it's going to be? But they're clearly right now they're just waiting for the Biden administration to come in to provide what they hope will be direct relief for the industry.
It's such a complicated ecosystem too, because even if somehow it was safe to be back open and full seating or 50% seating or whatever it might be, if they're in urban places, they're relying on people being at work. They're relying on sports up and running and the theater district and everything else. So, I mean, your average restaurant in New York or Washington or Atlanta or LA is not, some independent entity. It's deeply enmeshed in a broader sort of economic ecosystem, and there's pain throughout the whole system.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like, you reminded me of like the Navy Yard here in Washington, D.C., which is, it's an old neighborhood, but when the Nationals ballpark opened up, it boomed, like condominiums popped up, restaurants popped up, beer gardens popped up, and it was its own ecosystem, and it is just blossomed. And then the pandemic just flattened it. And there's going to be no baseball games played there, and maybe not even next season, depending on what happens. But I think the restaurant industry had to figure out a message to send out to people, and that message was, if you want us to survive, we need your support. Mm-hmm. And regardless if you're coming down for a Nationals baseball game, come down and get takeout. Support us if you live nearby. Use one of the third-party delivery systems to take food to get food delivered to your home. Whatever they could to deliver the message, like, without your support, we're not going to make it. And I think they've been fairly successful at that.
Let's stay with that for a second, because you did mention these many creative solutions with restaurant owners trying to keep as much staff as they can and trying to keep chefs and cooks active. The third-party delivery services, online marketing, various other things that we've seen. Do you think those things will persist beyond this moment? I mean, you were indicating earlier that that's for a lot of restaurants, that's not going to be enough. But for the ones that make it, is this some kind of a transition we're in the middle of here too, in terms of how people do experience what a restaurant is?
I think so. I mean, I think, all these pivots that restaurants have had to make, they did it for survival. But I think the thing is that they've learned, or maybe I hope that they've learned, is that the dining public has accepted it. Like if you are a white tablecloth seafood restaurant that is now selling chicken parm, um, you may have done that because you needed to have revenue and it was a nice comfort food that people want during a pandemic. But if it's successful, why not keep it going? Why not keep this as kind of a separate revenue stream to almost insure against these kinds of unpredictable collapse in revenue? And I think I hope that's going to be the message going forward. Like, don't put all your eggs in this basket. Like, really diversify your revenue streams, and delivery will definitely be one of them. I mean, I think delivery is a really loaded subject for a lot of restaurants. These third-party delivery systems, they charge up to 30%, and plus other fees. I mean, it can really lead to some crazy amount of fees for restaurants to pay just to have somebody else deliver their food. And that's just not a workable long-term solution for restaurants. And during the pandemic, you've seen jurisdictions across the country, including Washington, D.C., cap the limits on how much these third-party delivery companies can charge restaurants. Like in D.C., it's 15%. And, but once the pandemic is gone, their rates will just go back up to what they were previously. So I think what's, one of the solutions, and you start to see this happen already, is like some restaurants are forming their own delivery systems. They realize that this is people, I think we knew this before the pandemic. I mean, people stay home, they kind of shelter in place during the weekend. They turn on Netflix. They want to have food delivered at home. They don't necessarily want to go out, but they want to have a nice meal even at home. And so I think restaurants, the smarter ones, are really looking at ways to expand delivery and do it on their own terms, whether that's price or just, making sure that delivery person takes extra care with your food, that you're not one of 5 restaurants being delivered to that evening and the driver doesn't care about any of them. I think there's going to be some real interesting ideas coming down the pike next year and beyond on how restaurants deal with delivery.
Tim, you mentioned the real need for federal assistance. And of course, that applies to workers individually and to business owners as well. I wonder also, though, about the state and local restrictions, because it seems like it must be awfully hard to keep up with the tangle of restrictions that have been placed on all different kinds of venues, restaurants in this instance. And I think what must also be confusing, and if it was me, pretty frustrating, that certain kinds of businesses seem to be back while others are not. But it's hard to understand epidemiologically why it's safe to get your hair cut, but not safe to be in a restaurant.
Yeah, I think that's been a real sticking point for the restaurant industry. I mean, you've seen lawsuits all over the country, from, suburban Maryland here to Los Angeles. Restaurants just not understanding why they are being singled out for vectors of the coronavirus. And I think part of this is just that jurisdictions haven't been very good at communicating this information. And it's not exclusive to restaurants, right? But restaurants do present specific issues that help spread the virus. And there's been a lot of studies that, basically prove this. Like, you're in a closed space. There may not be good ventilation. There may be. There's air blowing the virus all around. I mean, there was a Korean study just recently that I wrote about that that showed that the coronavirus can be, float through the air on an air conditioning current and infect somebody on the other side of the restaurant in less than 5 minutes.
Wow.
So I mean, restaurants. You think about the ecosystem of just the dining room. You're sitting there. You have to take your mask off to eat and drink. So you're not keeping your mask on, which is already a problem. So if you are asymptomatic, you might be putting that into the environment. You may be putting, droplets or aerosol into the environment. The air currents in that restaurant could start spreading that around, depending on what kind of ventilation systems they have. You are talking and maybe talking loudly, which projects things out. And you're also sitting there for a long time. I mean, how long do you spend in a restaurant? I mean, you typically spend at least an hour, right? An hour, maybe 2 hours, depending on what kind of meal you're having. So you're being exposed to a longer amount of time. All these are risk factors in the spread of the virus. And are they exclusive to restaurants? No. But they are risks to that environment. And, I think that's a large part why you've seen shutdowns of restaurants, why you've seen people say you've got to cut off alcohol sales at 10 p.m. because, you get more alcohol in people and their inhibitions just start to disappear.
Right.
They'll keep their mask off, they'll talk louder, all these things that start spreading the virus around. So, I don't know how well these messages got spread to the restaurant owners, but clearly they all factor into the spread of this virus. And particularly it'll get worse during the winter months when we are in spaces. And and the other thing that has been shown is that the virus builds up. It spread via aerosol particles as well as droplets. In the droplets, we all thought we were safe if we kept 6 feet of distance, but now we know that it's aerosolized, that it's in the air for longer than we realized, and that it builds up. So if you're in an enclosed space for a long period of time, you may be in a space that has aerosols collecting there. And it's scary stuff. And as someone who's been through it, I don't want anyone to catch it. But I also don't want restaurants to suffer, which is why, it would be nice to see some relief for these restaurant owners I know local jurisdictions are just tapped out. Their tax monies, they're not getting the tax receipts they used to get, so they don't really have much to offer restaurants, but the federal government could step in, and maybe they will later. But, unless they really want to see a widespread, I don't know, it's been called an extinction event. That may be a little dramatic, but, a rearrangement of the restaurant landscape will occur without federal relief.
Well, the public health experts I've spoken with over this year are pretty unanimous too. And the idea that, we could have avoided a lot of this stress on workers and business owners, and in this case, restaurateurs and the people who work in the restaurant industry, by just being realistic about it. Pay people not to work. And the delivery options and the takeaway options, absolutely. And let that be the creative space and let people keep their craft up and keep them at work as much as possible. But just the realism that to invite people in, you just gave a really thoroughgoing and really chilling description of why a closed restaurant is particularly vulnerable space. Just take that on board and say, we're just not going to do that until we know it's safe for people. But we've had nothing but, obviously, we don't have to rehearse all the misdeeds of this administration, but that halting and that expectation that this is somehow an individual's responsibility to figure all this out, or an individual restaurateur's responsibility to figure out what's safe or not. They're not epidemiologists.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Yeah. It's hard enough to run a business, let alone to figure out how to keep the public safe from a virus that the knowledge base keeps expanding day by day, week by week.
I want to ask you something about food, but not about restaurants. And particularly early on in the pandemic, I'm sure you were watching and maybe even participating in this outpouring of enthusiasm for cooking. Because now everybody's home and yeast disappears from the store, and
right.
People were anxious about going into supermarkets, and they were stocking up with all these foods and getting out the cookbooks and then posting their people already posted what they ate in restaurants, but now posting their own creations and then gardening. So that I wonder what you think about that, and maybe this question of whether or not you think people's relationship with food is changing in this time because so many more people are trying things that they wouldn't have before, growing things, eating things, and cooking.
Without a doubt. I think that's one of, if there's any silver lining to the pandemic, and I'm not saying this is a silver lining, but it's that people really have, I think, learned to love to cook again. And although there was backlash against cooking, particularly if you've got a family and you've
Sure.
got to plan that out, I think we've seen in the last month or so, like a number of commentaries of people just said, I'm done with cooking. I was excited at first. I loved it at first. I was baking bread. I was cooking from all my favorite cookbooks. I was buying new cookbooks, but I'm over it now. And I get that. It's like, if you've got to plan out 2 meals, depending on how many times you eat a day, 7 days a week, it's going to get old real fast.
It's interesting that fatigue has set in, and I do wonder about that relationship too. That my just intuition, the more time people spend thinking about ingredients, thinking about what they eat, that will also redound to a renewed interest in dining when we can get back to that point. I mean, I think people will have a deeper appreciation of what chefs actually accomplish when they've actually tried to carry some of that off at home. I speak for myself.
Oh yeah, no, totally. It's like, I think disaster cooking has been sort of a thread of itself during the pandemic. I mean, people that have tried to do something maybe a little outside their comfort zone to push themselves, it doesn't work because, it takes a lot of practice. I mean, cooking is like any sort of art or skill. Cooking. Yeah, you have to practice. And, even in our own home, my wife loves to cook. I love to cook. We've had a few disasters. I'm afraid we don't post those on social media, but they're part of the process. And I frankly think, disasters and mistakes are really what make you a better cook. And as you suggested earlier, it's like once we do go back into restaurants, it's like you learn to appreciate all over again the great skill of these chefs that cook for us. It's like, oh my God, look at this refinement. Look what they did with this, garnish. Look what they did with this plating. It's like way beyond my skill set. And I think there will be that appreciation level again.
Disaster cooking has as you said, silver lining is not the phrase I'm looking for here, but I'll say it anyway, that there's a really fascinating double sense of that. The cooking we do in the disaster, which also we might take some risks that we wouldn't ordinarily. Like you, I won't post that on social media, but a lot of people have as a way to continue to build community. Right. I'm always astounded about the ways people are building community at this time, and that's one of those. We are moving into a season in which the economic impact of this is once again extremely pronounced, and food insecurity is real. We're reading that across the country. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of the restaurant industry and helping to address that crisis?
Well, I think it gets a little bit outside of my realm of coverage, but the one person I know who is most prominent in that space is someone I've written about a lot, which is Jose Andres.
Right.
And he's a force of nature. As soon as the pandemic hit, he closed his restaurants and within days turned them into basically like feeding stations for the hungry in DC. He was charging, but if you could show that you were unemployed, you got free food, and even if you did have a job, he was charging fewer prices. But then he did a larger pivot. He turned his nonprofit World Central Kitchen, which had mostly been focused on sort of natural disasters, going into zones that have been hit by hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, and providing food relief to people that suddenly find themselves with no ways to cook. But he pivoted into a a nationwide, and really, and even went overseas with this, uh, connecting with restaurants that found themselves either closed for indoor dining or really knocked back to very limited services, and paid them to produce food that then his nonprofit would then find ways to deliver to, could be seniors, who were vulnerable and couldn't go outside of their assisted living community because of the risks involved. And he was doing this in I think the last number I saw was over 400 cities, which is just remarkable. And I think they served, God, I want to say hundreds of millions of meals so far. And that is just, I can't imagine how much work, how much logistical work went into making all that happen. But he has been on the forefront of trying to not only feed people that are hungry in this country, but get restaurants back to work and get them some income when they really need the money.
I'm glad you shined some light on Jose Andres' work, and I've just put his website up here. People can check that out, joseandres.com, to learn more about what he's been doing. We're almost up on time. A discussion here with Tim Carman today on COVID calls, but Tim, I know you were filing a story today, and the holidays and going into the new year is always a very busy time in the restaurant industry. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the stories or themes that you think you're going to be really following as we move into 2021? We're entering a new phase of the pandemic with the vaccine available, although for most of us it won't be for some months. But I'm sure you have your eye on some developing things that are going to be moving in this industry through the winter.
Well, I think, unfortunately, one of the things we'll have to keep an eye on is how this is going to affect the restaurant industry without direct relief. I was talking with a couple of sources today. Like, you think about how long it took to get this relief bill through, and I haven't seen since we've talked. I don't know if Congress has passed it, but the text is out there. But this coronavirus relief package took months to get through both chambers of Congress, and to get the approval of the White House, to get everyone on the same page. So maybe it won't be as difficult with the next administration. Maybe it will. Who knows? But in the meantime, we know that it's going to be a month yet before the Biden administration comes in. That's 1 month. It's going to be a few weeks, probably at the very least, until another relief package can be put together. So we're talking 2 months when restaurants will have to try to survive on their own. And I think one of the unfortunate things is how many will survive, because this is going to be the hardest stretch for restaurants. So many jurisdictions, including New York, Southern California, Washington, D.C., closing down indoor dining. They're going to have to rely on takeaway or just close down, go into hibernation, which a lot of them are. And I think, in the next couple of months, we'll see who makes it. And that unfortunately will be something a lot of us in the food writing community will be following.
I've been talking with Tim Carman today, a food writer for the Washington Post, and you should read all of his work. And I particularly want people to, if you get a chance, check out his article. As a food writer with COVID, I worried I'd lose my sense of taste. It turned out to be much worse. Tim, thanks a million for joining me on COVID Calls today, especially under deadline. And glad you're healthy, and I hope we get a chance to talk again.
Scott, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you on COVID Calls tomorrow, and you can catch COVID Calls live 5 p.m. every day Eastern Time. Tomorrow, we'll be talking with Ed Yong, science writer for The Atlantic. So please do join me for that conversation. Stay healthy, everybody. See you tomorrow, 5 o'clock.